Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Red Hat webinar. Before we get started with today's presentation, there are a few items to quickly mention. You should see a taskbar at the bottom of the screen. Each icon is assigned to a particular element of today's webinar. If you're not sure what the icon does, hover over the icon with your mouse and a box will appear to tell you the function. Also, next to the slides window, you should see a blank Ask a Question box that allows you to type a question. After you type the question, click Submit to send it to our presenters. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and our presenters will address as many as possible following the presentation. You can submit any technical questions related to the webinar platform here. Please close down other browser windows or applications that might be splitting your bandwidth, including VPNs, as these might interfere with the audio or video stream. If you experience any connectivity issues, please refresh your browser. Today's session is being recorded, and all registrants will receive an email within 1 to 2 days of the event with a link to view this presentation on demand. Now I'm going to hand it over to today's first speaker so we can get started with the presentation.
Good morning, everyone, or I should say afternoon, and thank you for signing up for my humble webinar. My name is William Fielder, and I am a senior consultant for Red Hat. I've worked for a variety of institutions, to list a few: a bank, a university, logistics and warehousing, all three branches of the U.S. federal government. I say this not to boast my credentials, but to point out a commonality. Almost every one of these organizations struggled with security. They either had little to no security or pushed it to extreme lengths. At one time, I worked a short assignment where security was so tight that I was throwing my hands up in frustration before a single day had passed. There were so many rules, hoops, and thorny obstacles that I wondered, how does anyone get any actual work done around here? Grizzled full-time employees told me all the little loopholes and workarounds they used in order to accomplish anything. Loopholes, I should add, that security would have closed without mercy had they been made aware of them. And think about it. Employees were telling me, a 2-week contracted employee, how to circumvent their security so I could get my job done. On the flip side, I also once worked for a company that didn't think about computer security at all. Why would anyone attack us, they asked, out loud in those very words. We're not worth the effort to target. First, automated bots are equal opportunity attackers. Second, due to the nature of their business, they were indeed a viable target for deliberate, contemplated attacks by anyone who wanted to disrupt the food supply for the eastern seaboard of the United States. If anyone here is contemplating attacking the eastern seaboard of the United States, first, tell me so I can make flight plans. Second, you should also know this company's security is now much improved. They were so happy with the new controls put in place, they gave me a large frozen turkey as a little thank you. How many of you have heard security described as a sliding scale? Security versus usability, always in conflict with each other. Nothing comes without a trade-off or a cost. As you slide towards usability, your system gets less secure. Go harder towards security, and no one can get any work done. The real kicker? The scale is spring-loaded. It gets harder to push the more secure you go. It resists security and always drifts towards usability. Our poor blue team is playing against an opponent with weighted dice. Blue team must question their purpose. Their top answer is likely to secure the organization against inside and outsider threats, and that's a fine goal. However, another goal should be to help the organization achieve its mission. And that's where the sliding scale casts its long, miserable shadow. The attackers are relentless, tireless, and ultimately have an advantage over the defenders. The simplest and quickest solution is to lock everything down as tightly as possible and deny user requests for access. But if they take it too far, then the organization is hampered in its ability to perform its stated mission. Poorly thought out rules and draconian controls can wreak as much havoc as any attacker. It just might take longer and drain your will to live in the process. A problem that one runs into: if you lock things down too tightly, the user will find a workaround so they can get work done. A new vulnerability's been added to the system. Holes appear in your carefully crafted wall. Another problem occurs when there truly are no workarounds, and the system is as secure as a chained and bolted underwater vault. Work grinds along and withers, but it's secure. Blue Team must remember they are there to serve the company and its mission, while using their unique skills to provide best effort, best practice security. They must also remember that perfect security is not possible. It is a journey, not a destination, as the experts like to say. But an organization's end users also need to realize that perfect insecurity is all too easily possible. Indeed, all but guaranteed without careful attention and vigilance. What purpose is the business mission if anyone, at any time, can reach their hand into the company's financial and data cookie jars? Or if a fire or a flood can wipe the company, perhaps literally, off the map? With no security of any kind in place, you invite every nefarious agent of nature and man to turn your plans, hopes, dreams, and purpose into a fine gray ash. This is ultimately not a technical problem, but a political or a social problem. This is where everyone in the organization must collectively ask, what do we require to safely and efficiently accomplish our work? It's not about what the users would like to have. This is a question that will never have a final answer, and ultimately leads to complete and unfettered access to everything. Obviously, this is not an optimal solution. Of course, users often don't know what they need until they need it, and when they do need it, they need it now, or so they believe. Conventional wisdom would say this leaves us with two competing approaches to security: default to deny and then add services, or default to allow and block unnecessary services. I have seen both in action, but default to deny is far more common, and certainly a simpler approach in the long run. However, default to deny is still error-prone and easily overwhelmed or subverted by bureaucracy. How about a third approach? Don't default to anything. Instead, ask the organization, what is it that you need, and how can we best get you there? This is where everyone tosses aside the pitchforks and torches, sits down around the bonfire, and hammers out the details. What goals do we wish to accomplish? What do we require to achieve said goals? How do we do so while meeting legal compliance, stopping the bad guys, and respecting both Mother Nature's and Murphy's laws? Ultimately, everyone must share an equal place at the table of jolly cooperation in order to get security as close as possible to the organization's sweet spot. That sweet spot on the sliding scale is going to be different for every organization, even between those with similar goals. It is a constant back and forth that requires continual tuning. You can't just set the required bits and walk away. Blue Team has to work with the rest of the company and even be their best friend. When security walls itself off and functions more like a distant eye of Sauron, that's when users find their own ways to get things done. The sweet spot is an almost magical place to be. Security and usability work together hand in glove, not fist to face. If you can manage to keep driving with the lines, you can almost forget that the sliding scale exists, but don't forget. Complacency can kill here, so keep your eyes on the road. Blue Team could introduce users to the concept of the sliding scale and describe them the madness that lies in either extreme. They should communicate, put themselves in the user's shoes, and be transparent about the process. Blue Team can do a far better job if they are a public park, not a private island. However, users must also hold up their side of the work as well, especially executives and top decision makers. Everything trickles down from the top. If the directors push for more security, it gets done, often a little too well. If they don't care or make exclusions for themselves, then no one will take security seriously and the rot of cynicism sets in. There is no from the bottom up security. It only works from the top down. There must be buy-in from the highest levels. Remember earlier that I mentioned working for a company that didn't believe they needed security? The ones who didn't think they were worth targeting? Once they were convinced that they very much were a potential tasty target, they completely changed their attitude. A seriousness about good security controls came right down from the CEO, and he made no exceptions for himself. He also allowed none for other executives. In fact, social engineering training prevented a barrage of cache wiring scams from finding fertile ground. The finance team loved to forward to me the latest feeble attempts the scammers had made to impersonate one vice president or another. The company also quickly and efficiently recovered from a cryptoware attack because the correct remediation and response plans were in place. And get this, backups were regularly tested. Remember, there are no good backups, only good restores. These security controls were put into place over the course of months because everyone talked and, more importantly, listened to each other. The CEO himself sat for interviews about the business. Finance and legal were brought in right from the start. The security team took note of what everyone required to do their jobs and implemented controls that worked for the company rather than against it. Let us return to the contract assignment, where security was gripped like an iron fist, and the simple act of editing a single line of code might require more text to justify than the content of this presentation. Root access was understandably tightly controlled. It required checking out the root password with a stated reason and waiting for approval. Once checked out and used once, the root password changed. Note that approval could take as little as 30 seconds or as long as 2 hours. The temporary account they had created for me was never granted sudo access, which is why I had to ask for root. If I recall correctly, sudo access was granted about a month after I completed the assignment. Terminal sessions were configured to time out after 10 minutes of idling. I will admit, I can be a slow and ponderous thinker and easily lost in rabbit holes of documentation. Countless sessions terminated while I was engaged in another process requiring me to check out another root password and wait for another approval and explain why I needed it again. I eventually added a server alive interval option to my SSH commands, but even that would have been frowned upon as against policy. A small workaround so I could complete the work they were paying handsomely for. It's never a good thing when a client pays me a large sack of cash to sit there and drink coffee. redhat.com itself was blocked on internal web browsers, along with several other sites that I could consider important and necessary parts of my toolbox. And yet, several websites covering various American sports were allowed. If I might hazard a guess, I bet it's because someone with a high pay grade made an exception for themselves. That was not the only exception either. Between the granite fortress levels of security, combined with loopholes shared around like underground pirate zines, and then mixed with a healthy dose of executive exclusions and a few cubes of artisanal ice, it made for an atmosphere of sarcasm and weariness. Their security team was a faceless, remorseless entity that required total obeisance and burnt offerings. My only interaction with them was through email. One full-time employee called it Kafkaesque, and no one was able to tell me where the security group was physically located, or I should say, many people tried to tell me, but they were all wrong and I eventually gave up. Unlike my first example, the company that gave me the turkey, none of the divisions at this firm communicated with each other. Everything was a blank, smooth-walled silo with paper airplane memos passing back and forth. Security was as far on the scale as you could go without requiring quarantine decontamination protocols. Daily work for the average employee was a tiring, frustrating grind. On one hand, their blue team had every locked and bolted technical security control in place that you could dream of. On the other hand, they were so secure that all it did was make employees' lives more difficult without necessarily making anything more secure. To take an organization that is well on the usability side of the scale requires a great deal of planning and effort, but can actually be easier because communication is often smoother in such environments. Once Blue Team can get everyone together to discuss their needs, they can develop a security plan and begin implementing their controls. At that point, all the work is pure elbow grease, followed by regular review. An organization far on the security side of the scale, you could make it less secure and more usable simply by doing nothing. Absolutely nothing. Stop enforcing the process. Let the scale slide back to its natural state of usability. This is also typically a terrible idea and I wouldn't normally recommend it, but it might be exactly what some groups need to do. The absolute most difficult issue in high security environments is often that no one talks to each other. Everything is compartmentalized and firewalled and fraught with authorizations. Compliance is brandished like a weapon or a holy symbol. Simply getting everyone into a room together can become one of the 12 feats of Hercules. Often what is required is for an outsider to come in and bring key stakeholders together. The group needs a demonstration on how their security is so tightly wound that it is having a negative work impact, or maybe even making them less secure. Again, nothing changes until those at the very top are willing and agree to carry it through. Public sector organizations add a new variable to the equation. They are usually the ones who wrote the policies that commercial sector companies use as templates. The United States has FIPS, FISMA, NIST 800, HIPAA, FERPA, and other uppercase initialisms I'm sure I'm forgetting. So many policies, compliance requirements, and 1,000-page checklists with matching footnotes that I wonder if anyone has ever managed to perfectly meet any of it, or if it's even possible. While the U.S. federal government agencies are not perfect, they do generally give at least an honest try. Why can't they perfectly implement their own congressionally signed procedures? Because government agencies the world over are notorious for not talking to each other or even within themselves. It appears to come with the territory of governing large groups of humans, which always gets messy with edge cases. Plus, these agencies have a certain weight and inertia to them that no company that hasn't been in existence since before the Industrial Revolution could hope to match. I also mentioned earlier that I worked for a university. It currently holds the record for the longest I've ever been at a single job. If anyone here has ever worked and overseen an academic network, it's a whole new ballgame compared to a typical corporate environment. You can't really block access to anything because of the expectations of educational inquiry. Researchers might be digging into extremely remote, deeply obscure, and certainly not safe for work or life corners of the internet to source their papers. And since higher education errs on the side of the usability, such institutions are prized targets for the bad guys to use as launching off points for their real attacks. Here, the sliding scale is not only spring-loaded, it is also has a boxing glove on the spring waiting to plant in the blue team's face on a regular basis. No matter how hard we tried to educate the campus, phishing campaigns found marks at least a few times per week. How many times did we have to say the help desk will never ask for your password? One staff member gave away their password 6 times. The president of the college fell for one, but I will grant that it was. So I was talking about how there are students at the university who they would mess around in the network. It was always simple curiosity. I never actually came across a student who was deliberately or maliciously trying to wreck the network. They were always just kind of bumbling around and, oh, what happens if I do this? So I actually took these students under my wing. And towards the end of my era at the college, I installed security thinking into enough students, they began to spread the word for me. And then there were sunnier days. But budgets are tight and security often falls by the wayside. So remember, security has to come from the top. I bet if the president of the college himself had given a talk about phishing, everyone would have taken note, but we could never get him to do it. So here's another tale. Another past job was for a think tank in Washington, D.C. Have you guys ever heard of think tanks? They pay researchers to turn top-shelf whiskey into peer-reviewed white papers. They supply a stable of authoritative talking heads for 24-hour cable news. Imagine, if you will, a college with no students. The scholars can focus all their energy into research. In the case of this particular think tank, it was economics, foreign affairs, corporate, and military strategy. One nice thing about the place is the scholars treated me like another scholar. The interns treated me like something stuck on their shoe, or at least until I wandered by to loom over their desks. What made this environment a lively place to work was that it was continuously targeted by deliberate and intentional attackers, some of them funded by nation states. Nothing puts a spring in your step like knowing for a fact that Red Team is specifically targeting you in particular. We had all the funding we could ever want. Hire more help? Done. Need more equipment? You got it. But it was also very much like a typical academic environment in that I could not lock things down too hard. On one hand, I had an effectively unlimited budget, but on the other, my hands were tied down by the needs of the environment. Combine that with black hats that hated us in particular, it made for a Haiti workday. We managed to find the sweet spot, but it required the dedication of monks to hold firm against the constant attacks and the figurative handcuffs. How about the internet itself? Built entirely on the pillar of usability. Steve Crocker wrote RFC1 in the shower, or so he told me. The internet was designed to be resilient, fast, and open, constructed on shared standards. Host names were copied around in a host.txt file managed by Elizabeth Feinler at the Stanford Research Institute. The assigned addresses list was maintained by John Postel at the Information Sciences Institute. We didn't have our first DNS system until 1983. Before that, we simply shared all these unencrypted text files with each other. Throughout the early years of the internet was about sharing, and practically everyone knew everyone else. I believe, and I'm willing to be corrected on this, that the first RFC that deals with security is RFC 644, published in July 1974 and written by Bob Thomas at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, the company that built the first internet routers. It's titled On the Problem of Signature Authentication for Network Mail and deals with the issue of email authenticity and non-repudiation. The first computer virus, also written by our good friend Bob Thomas at Bolt, Beranek, Newman in 1971. It was called Creeper. It wasn't malicious or destructive. It merely printed, "I'm the creeper, catch me if you can," on the terminal screen. The first virus removal software, Reaper, was quickly written to clean up Creeper, and thus a whole industry was born to deal with viruses, worms, and malware. The first spam email was sent by Gary Thurk at Digital Equipment Corporation on May 3, 1978. 90% of all emails sent every day are spam, and thus another industry was born. The first paper published on firewall technology was in 1988, also by Digital Equipment Corporation. Securing the entire internet is doubly hard since it was founded on the ideals of usability. You not only have spring-loaded brass knuckles on the security side, the usability side is holding onto your pants and pulling. Security is bolted, taped, and epoxied onto the sides of the internet. Very usable, complete transparency in the design, open standards, and so much communication, it's a full-time job just to keep up. Many smart people are working on the issues of security. And as the internet continues to mature and change, open communication and peer review will eventually help secure, as well as can be done without a complete redesign. Good security is not about technology, or blind faith and checklists, or mindless rote procedure. It's about constant, honest communication and attention to detail. I'm not saying to ignore the checklist and procedures, just continuously evaluate them. Know when your checklist is no longer valid, or your policies make you vulnerable. Understand the costs and the trade-offs you're making for your environment. I will say again, good security requires constant attention, care, and vigilance. The sliding scale is always and forever resisting security and defaulting to usability. To paraphrase another quote, reality has a well-known usability bias, but it can be all too easy to push the scale so far towards security that you break it. Entropy wins if blue team allows it to. Stasis and stagnation win if blue team goes too far. As always, red team only has to win once. Allow me to sum up. Good security is hard work. Blue team can never rest, always detecting, hopefully preventing, scrambling to recover when things inevitably go sideways. It's up to blue team to break down their silo sincerely talk with their fellow stakeholders and continually push against the gravity well of usability into just the right amount of security. Once they find that magical spot on the scale, hold fast to it, embrace it, remain ever watchful, continue learning, keep the fire lit, adjust as necessary, and don't let red team win. And test those backups. Thank you. I'll now take a look at the questions, open the floor for further questions. Raise my question room. All right. Just going through the list. Lots of lost audios, my apologies. Nothing happened here on my end that I noticed. Will I be providing continuous education credit? I honestly don't know if this does. I would have to, if the facilitators can answer that for me, I don't know what the answer to that is. Okay. What is your view on security being segregated out of other orgs being detrimental to the concept of baking security into the whole life cycle? I think segregating security out that's siloing, and that's generally not a good idea. I believe that security needs to be woven into the fabric of everything else in a constant dialogue going back and forth. The biggest problem I see with high secure environments is, as I kept saying in the talk, that no one was talking to each other, and security would implement controls without taking any recognition of how it might impact the work environment. And the company has come together to achieve a purpose, and if security is implementing controls that defeat that purpose, then that's actually not a good thing. And the best way around that is to have security sprinkled generously among the different organizations so everyone can keep talking. Thank you for the question. And that was Brad Galloway. I will mark that up. All right. Michael Liu asks, how do you know if you've hit the sweet spot? That's a difficult question to answer. Well, I talk about how security is a journey, and everyone needs to sit down and talk to each other. If you feel that if you have your backups in place, you have your firewalls in place, you have your monitoring, you have your logging, you have everything, ports closed, processes not running, your employees educated on proper security practices. And then on the other side, employees are able to get their job done without complaint. And that's probably a good sign you've hit the sweet spot. But you always have to constantly be paying attention to it. I feel like there's something else I need to say about that. Pardon me for a second while my gears whir. In security, you have detection, prevention, and recovery. A lot of companies drop the ball on the recovery part. If you feel that if you're detecting everything you can detect and people are actually paying attention to it, and you have remediation plans in place, and people are still able to get their work done, then I think then you've found the sweet spot. B.B. Haynes, do you have any good books to recommend on getting people to the table to talk? I don't, alas, I don't. Many of the security books I've read have all been about how to implement controls and close ports and do logging and do monitoring and have a disaster plan in place. I have come to the realization of getting people to talk entirely on my own, not from reading it somewhere else. And I think you may be pointing out here, Mr. Haynes, a big gaping hole in security literature. So maybe I can fix that myself. All right. Daniel Linder, how do you approach the changes needed when it's a remote government organization that is forcing a bad, old, fragile process? You have to start talks with the people right at the top of this government organization, and they probably need a third party to come in. It sounds like nothing is going to change from the inside. Someone has to come from the outside and get everyone at the top of the pyramid to sit down and talk. You know, get some folks in the middle and the lower rungs to come in too. But it'll take an outsider, and you got to convince the folks in charge. If you can't do that, nothing will change. So bring in outside consultants, have them analyze the situation, and tell the people on top, here's what needs to change, otherwise you're vulnerable, you're in danger, and think about how your names will look in the newspaper when everything inevitably turns south. Right. David Martin, is it fair to say that security is a mindset, not a process? Absolutely, that is a wonderful way to put it. I've always heard security is a journey, not a destination. But I think the way you just said it is an excellent way to say it. It's a constantly thinking about it, constantly observing and making changes and tweaks and being vigilant. Excellent turn of phrase, Mr. Martin. Anthony J. Williams, how can we create a more secure environment with basic Linux knowledge? Thanks. Well, with basic Linux knowledge, when it comes to purely technical aspects, if you're going to continue working with Linux, you need to learn about how processes work, ports work. You need to get an idea of how everything runs under the hood. Get familiar with systemd, get familiar with firewalld. Of course, I'm a Red Hatter here, so I'm talking in the Red Hat method, but get used to systemd, firewalld. Don't disable SE Linux, please. At least put it permissive mode so you can see what it's doing and make changes accordingly. But remember, security is not all about technology, and so don't focus just on the bolts and gears of Linux. Think about the organization you're working for, what they're trying to accomplish, and how you need to defend them, not just with Linux, not just with firewalls, but educating the employees, talking to them about scams and phishing and emails. And just like I said before, make sure you include the executives in these talks. All right. Keith McMillan. I have worked for security orgs that report up through legal and those that report up through IT. Have you had better success with one versus the other or with other reporting structures? In a way, having security go through legal can make things easier because legal has a more visceral understanding of certain things. Certain security needs to be in place, otherwise our name's going to be in the New York Times front page tomorrow morning. So that's part of what makes it easier. The problem with legal is they can get a little too conservative, and I think some legal departments would be happy to make work slow down a little bit if it even more prevents their faces from being in the paper. IT, the security going straight through IT, they can often get lost in the weeds of pure technical controls and not step back and think about how it's still about people, and you need to talk to the people, find out what they need, find out what they want to achieve, and educate them in proper security practices. So I guess the bottom line, too long didn't read for that, was legal will make it easier to get security in place, but you got to be careful not to go too far. And going through IT, you probably will get security done faster and properly implemented controls-wise, but then you've got to make sure, don't forget about talking to people, and don't forget your mission. Okay. Michael Williams, Red Hat has lots of security certifications, but not a lot of official study guides. How do you study for these? Michael, I have a totally unfair advantage. Since I am a Red Hat employee, I can take any of our courses for free, including our online virtual labs. I basically have a Red Hat University login that I can take any of our courses. That's, in fact, I'd say one of the benefits of working for Red Hat is I can study anything we have to my heart's content, and it makes me a happy little camper. I'm sure Red Hat access.redhat.com has access to security papers and basic security. Here's how to think about it, here's what to implement, but you're absolutely right. There aren't a lot of publicly available. If you want to study for the certification, we don't have documents out there. So it seems like I have found two security book voids here. One, study guides, and two, talking about security when it comes to the organization and getting the people involved. So, Michael, I'm afraid you have revealed another gap that needs to be filled. Anthony Williams, also, do you believe we should continue the practice of least privilege first, then loosen accordingly? As I said in my talk, I've actually dealt with both approaches. And where another approach is you have everything open and lock things down as needed. The method you propose, least privilege, that is the simplest. It is much simpler to do it that way. Deny all and then allow. That's because you guarantee at least a certain base security. But the thing with least privilege is you do have to make sure you give any given employee enough privilege that they can actually work. The biggest problem I see with least privilege, and again I'll stress I do think this is still the better solution, is least privilege can get bogged down with bureaucracy, checklists, and people stop thinking about what is the point of these privileges. People do actually need to do their jobs. And so anyway, defaulting to deny can get a little too hardcore, and you need to kind of lessen the grip a little bit. More questions? Brad Galloway, what is your opinion on the shift to risk management framework? Alas, I must shamefully admit, I don't have an opinion on that right now, so I don't feel I can properly answer the question. James Fielder, can you explain the rabbit theme throughout the presentation? Okay. So my wife and I, we've had pet rabbits for a long time, and she and I operate a nonprofit animal rescue, specifically a rabbit rescue, Eastern Shore Rabbit Rescue and Education Center, Eastern Shore of Maryland. And I've been working with rabbits for so long that I probably have the equivalent skill set of a veterinary technician, except purely for rabbits. Anyway, that is the rabbit theme. Okay. Trevor Chandler, are you suggesting that I get the executive level involved in the decision of syslog versus theme usage? No. When it comes down to the nitty-gritty of exactly how you're going to implement your technical controls, no, you don't need to get executives involved that hardcore. Although you'd be surprised, some executives enjoy that sort of thing. You just need to convince them to buy into having good security controls at all. Once you convince them that we need this, not specifically this low level, but we need to have some kind of logging in place, we need to have some kind of monitoring in place, and more importantly, executives, there can't be exclusions in place. They can't make exceptions for themselves. The security has to apply from top to bottom, and they have to buy into it. They have to go all in. But no, you don't have to get them involved in ground level, down in the weeds, ones and zeros. They wouldn't even be able to properly answer you anyway. Probably. Again, some executives get into this sort of thing. So find them, and you'll get some great cheerleaders. Okay, Trevor Chandler. I'm trying to read your question, but it keeps getting pushed down. In terms of security in a Red Hat Linux environment, what would you say are the top 2 items technologies, e.g. SE Linux, Firewall D, etc., an admin should concentrate on? I know you said that technology should not be the sole focus. Okay. If we're saying purely technology, what to focus on in your Red Hat Linux environment, the number one thing to focus on is know how the operating system actually works. The start process, I used to say init, but now systemd, how processes work, how ports work, how you can start and stop things, how you can block things, how you can basically know how Red Hat actually functions. That is the number one way to get better on how to secure it. And that includes don't disable SE Linux, don't disable Firewall D. If you want to get even more specific, yeah, learning how SE Linux and Firewall D work are very good things. SE Linux has gotten so much better over the years. Now, granted, I'm a huge SE Linux evangelist, and not to beat my chest here, I'm very, very good at it. But I will admit, way back in the days of RHEL 5, SE Linux was a little bumpy there for a bit. But now, RHEL 7, RHEL 8, you practically forget it's there. It works so well. Sorry, too long, didn't read. Just get really good at understanding how the operating system works, how it all functions under the hood. And at that point, how to secure it practically explains itself. Anthony Williams, one more question. How often, in your opinion, should a company audit their security? If you're talking about having a third-party auditor come in, I'd say once a year, unless you have an incident, and then you should probably have auditing come in after an incident. But if everything is working smoothly, I'd say once a year for an outside company to come in. As for yourself, I'd say internal quarterly reviews on how things are working. Again, unless there's an incident, and then you have to respond immediately to that. If everything's working fine, your internal staff quarterly reviews. And I believe I have gone through. It scrolled by a bit fast for me, but I think I managed to capture all of the questions. All right, unless anybody has any other questions to add, I hope you had a grand old time, and it was a pleasure talking to you. Sorry about the audio hiccup there, but I'm sure we're all still friends, right? You do have seven more minutes if you wish to question or shake your fist or otherwise make colorful commentary. Oh, thanks, you guys. Oh, another one went by. Michael Liu, should password changes be required on service accounts? Yes, I think so, but not as frequently as on regular user accounts. I would say make a service account password longer, a little more complicated and longer, harder to guess. And if you say have 90-day regular user password changes, maybe twice a year for service accounts. And remember, when it comes to password security, the number one way to increase a password strength is length, not complication. So a 25-character password that only uses lowercase letters and white space is exponentially more secure than, say, a 10-character password that can use any character on the keyboard. Deborah Windorf, what backup systems does Red Hat recommend? We actually don't recommend any specific product. I mean, of course, we have our own built-in ways of doing things, but when it comes to actual backup, full-on hardware backup solutions, we don't have any specific horse in the race that we back. But of course, we work well with plenty of products out there. I'd say you can just check our hardware compatibility list at access.redhat.com, and if it says, hey, we're compatible, you can't go wrong. Okay. Michael Liu, comment on defense in depth. Yes, absolutely. If you put all your eggs into a single layer of defense, you are destined to have a very bad day sometime in the near future. Defense is all about layers. Heck, the entire universe is all about layers. Everything runs in layers. In fact, I have another presentation I could give all about defense in depth. So yes, you need to have different layers to block different things. You need to have collapsible walls so your defenders can go back to a more secure location, so to speak. So yes, defense in depth is very important. Doesn't matter how much your exterior is hardened if you have a soft, gooey center. For a Red Hat Linux environment, this is Trevor Chandler, what do you feel is the most robust login authentication mechanism to deploy? I would say most robust authentication method is Identity Manager with single sign-on. And Identity Manager is a Red Hat product that costs nothing. It has no subscription. It's part of the RHEL 7 repo. And just from it, you can say who's allowed to log into where. You can have role-based access. You can have host-based access. You can implement Kerberos. You can implement LDAP. All of your users on it. All of the changes are done on it. And you don't even have to have user accounts on any other server. So definitely Red Hat Identity Manager. Hello, Alfred Wiltrot. I'm afraid I don't have the hardware compatibility link handy. You should just be able to do a web search for Red Hat Enterprise Linux hardware compatibility list. I'm sorry, in hindsight, I actually should have had that available. Anyway, just search Red Hat Enterprise Linux hardware compatibility. Michael Williams, and I'm afraid the time is over, Michael. I cannot answer your question. We are 4, 3, 2, 1 to an end. Unless, hey, they don't actually stop me from talking. Well, what do you know? Anyway, Michael Williams, having worked in energy, pharma, telecom, my experience has been whenever there was a breach, it was almost always someone on the inside versus outside actors. What has been your experience? A disgruntled employee or an inside attacker is the most difficult thing security can deal with. And the number one thing you can do is have some kind of monitoring and logging in place that's not only monitoring incoming, but it's also monitoring outgoing. And more importantly, someone needs to be actually paying attention to it. Companies often drop the ball. They set up a logging and monitoring system, and they say, hey, we've got monitoring up, and then no one actually looks at the alerts. So you need to tune the monitoring and logging to look at connections coming from the inside out. You need to set the proper alarms, and someone actually needs to be paying attention to these alarms. And the only other way to deal with this is a social thing, that you have employee education on security. And I could probably do a whole nother talk on how to keep an eye out for, it's a terrible thing, but sometimes you do have to keep an eye out for suspicious behavior. Someone who's obviously disgruntled, having trouble, their work has suddenly gone from great to poor. There's drastic personality changes. Sometimes you think, man, they're just having a bad day, but it's something you have to pay attention to. But pure tech, watch stuff coming from the inside, actually pay attention to it. All right. How do you deal with InfoSec that doesn't understand Red Hat, only understands Windows? This is going to sound rude. If they're any good at InfoSec at all, they'll understand that it doesn't matter what operating system you have under the hood. That these security measures apply regardless. Forget Red Hat, forget Windows. Say you're running PigeonOS or something like that. The security methods are going to be the same. The ideas of security are the same. And it's just, when you're comparing Windows and Linux, it's just about the little nitty-gritty details of exactly how you implement it. So the Windows guys shouldn't care. They should just know we have these security controls we need to worry about. The fine, detailed implementation solutions, well, we can worry about that later. David Martin, more talks forward would be good. I'd be more than happy to give more talks. I've got other things I could babble on endlessly about. Talks about defense in depth, how to defend against inside attacks, lots of little things I could do. And I don't see any. Well, folks, I believe the time really has come at this point. And thank you for coming again to my humble webinar this afternoon. And I'd be happy to give more talks. I'm glad you enjoyed today's talk. And I hope you guys all have an absolutely fabulous afternoon. So this is William signing out.